of your micros and your cameras. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all at our, what it will be the last seminar of our term and the last history seminar today. And it gives me a great pleasure to welcome our speakers, uh, uh, Ilan Stavans and Jorge Cañizares Guerra. Ilan Stavans is Louis Severing Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Armhest College, the publisher of Restless Books and the host of NPR podcast In Contrast. His work, I have to say, is just impressive in the academic field, but also as a fiction writer, literary critique, translator, editor, and publisher. And I won't have time here to outline all his books, but I just mentioned some of them. The Seventh Heaven, Travels Through Jewish Latin America, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, The Early Years, editor of the Oxford Handbook of Latino Studies, and the Norton Anthology of Latino Literature, and several books of conversation, including Que es la Hispanidad with Ivan Jakšić, a colleague who was in our seminar last week. He's the recipient of numerous international prizes, and his work has been translated into 20 languages and have been adapted to the screen, TV, radio, and theater. We are very privileged to welcome him back at the Latin American Center. Ilan was with us in November 2018. And today he will be discussing talking with Jorge Cañizares Guerra about his most recent production on the Popol Vuh retelling. We're also very privileged to have Jorge Cañizares Guerra and welcome him back to the Latin American Center, also the author and editor of a dozen books, many of which have been translated also into several languages. His book, How to Write the History of the New World, won several academic prizes and was selected as one of the best books of the year by prestigious magazines like The Economist and the Times Literary Supplement. His articles have appeared in some of the most prestigious journals on the history of the profession in various countries, including the American Historical Review, the William and Mary Quarterly, Journal of Early Modern History, etc. And as I said, welcome back, Jorge. He was here with us in May 2016. So I just want to express them our gratitude to the Latin American Center for being with us. And without further ado, the floor, Jorge and Ilan, is yours.
All right. Should I take over, or you want to do it, Ilan?
No, go ahead. Jorge.
Well, I'm supposed to interview you. I think we come to the Popol Vuh from very different angles. I come to the Popol Vuh from the angle of a historian who is interested in the book as a document, as paperwork produced in the former kingdom of Quiché, whatever is left with the arrival of Alvarado and the Dominicans, and as part of a larger production of títulos in many different languages, in indigenous languages, and also the arrival of the alphabetical script to this region of highland Guatemala. So that is my angle. I am interested in the contextualization of the origins of this document as part of a larger genre of documentation by indigenous societies in the 1500s throughout the Spanish America, from Mexico to the Andes. And so that is my interest. Now you come to the Popol Vuh from a very different angle, which is a modern rendition of this work. And the value of this work as a piece of literature to this day. So you rework it and offer a different interpretation, as it were. So I would like to ask you, what are the major changes that you introduced to this retelling of the Popol Vuh that contrasts with the original Popol Vuh as presented by Jimenez, Dominican Jimenez in the early 1700s?
Jorge, it's an enormous pleasure and honor to be with you here. we have coincided in a couple of the magazines and in a couple of the academic sites. And it is always very stimulating to me to hear your perspective as a historian whose work I admire enormously. I approach the Popol Vuh, as you said, as a literary critic and as a literary historian as well. In this particular occasion, I wanted to imagine the possibility of bringing the Popol Vuh to a large readership that that has, for a variety of reasons, not had access to it. That is, a readership that does not belong to the academic world, to the scholarly world. And in doing so, I wanted to present this as a work of world literature, a la par with Beowulf, the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Nordic sagas, books that are about origins, that are foundational texts in the shaping of peoples or nations, and they become catalysts for a collective consciousness among those people. I'm originally from Mexico, as you know, and when I was a young man, even before immigrating to the United States, first as a journalist, and then eventually as a scholar, I read the Popol Vuh just as part of the menu of books that were available at that time. I'm thinking of the early 80s in Mexico, late 70s, early 80s in Mexico. There were a couple of popular editions that circulated. Maybe one of them, I have a loose memory, being available not only in bookstores, but also in newsstands. Not too far from my house. I used to live in the southern part of Mexico City, next to La UNAM, the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. And I very distinctly recollect having in my hands, in a tactile way, that popular paperback edition that was my first coming to this book. Over the years, and this is many years later, I have thought about the Popol Vuh as the missing link, along with the book of Chilam Balam, but more the Popol Vuh even, as a book of beginnings, a book of creation, a book of origins that tells the story of the Quiché people in the context of the Maya, and that is somehow secluded, ghettoized, isolated, not open or accessible enough to the larger audiences in other languages, though there have been translations into German and Italian and French, and a number of them into English. What I wanted to do here, directly going to your question, Jorge, was to bring it to a larger audience, not prepare a scholarly edition per se, but do it from a scholar's point of view, re-entering a study of Quiché that I spent time on myself, and doing the historical research as thoroughly as possible. But here's the kind of gig or the approach. I did not want to do a straightforward translation, the way I have done in other books by, I don't know, Rulfo or Sor Juana or Cabeza de Vaca. I wanted to do a retelling of the book. I wanted to have the liberty to present it in a language that departed from the original, while still paying tribute to that original, in a way that maybe Neil Gaiman, for instance, has done with the Nordic sagas, or that Ackroyd has done with the Canterbury Tales. That allowed me to have a bit more freedom as a translator, be more playful, do use my own style, and at the same time respect the parameters of the text as much as possible. It is not the various originals that I looked at. It is a way of redressing the text for a 21st century audience. Maybe just to conclude this part, Jorge, I would say that the difference between translation and retelling is how loyal or disloyal the translator is to the original, though the retelling is still very much married to that original and feels a sense of duty, responsibility, a passing of the torch to the next generation.
Okay, well, thank you. One of the things that struck me about your retelling is, well, there are many things that caught my attention about retelling, but one of the things that is the most striking of them all is the ending of the Popol Vuh, in which you have in the original the motivation ultimately of the telling, all the lineages of the Quiché, all the different groups within, and all the genealogies that ultimately lead to the purpose of the document, which is claims of grace and Mercedes vis-a-vis the colonial regime, and it's part of all these genre of títulos in different languages of the highlands, the Quiché, but also Cachiquel and Suchujil and other languages. And we can talk about 20 to 30 of these titles. And Popol Vuh is part of that tradition. So when you take out the ending of genealogies and lineages that justify principales and caciques and ultimately all the titles of tribute and labor, et cetera, that went into the making of the títulos. A part of the motivation for the creation of a document is lost, or is lost to the audiences. And by losing that part of the motivation for the creation of a document, you also might lose the context of the content. For instance, you have one of the beautiful or striking things about the Popol Vuh to me is this telling and retelling of the story of idolatry. That the very creations, the very makings of humans out of wood, out of corn, tend to be a failure. These individuals are immoral ultimately, and they have to be, the creations have to be destroyed for a new creation to happen. And so it's a story of idolatry and punishment to idolatry. So the failed idols that humans, even humans made out of the real stuff, which is corn, fail to capture, right? Fail to understand that there is these heavenly lords, Lord of Earth and Lord of Heaven, that are the actual creators, and humans fail to understand that. So in that sense, it makes sense why Jimenez and the Dominicans never brought this type of documentation to before the Inquisition. Actually, they embraced and promoted this type of documentation, or this type of creation, even though the Popol Vuh critiques the bearded white man. It's a critique of the encomenderos, a critique of the conquistadors, not a critique of the Dominicans. It seems to me. It's kind of an embrace of a new technology, which is the technology of alphabetical scripts, as are all the titles of the Highland, former Confederation of Quiché. But by no means is a critique of the colonial regime, it seems to me. as the preface seems to suggest. So I don't know whether you agree or.
Wonderful, wonderful, Jorge. To me, the Popol Vuh, designed for a 21st century audience that is beyond the academic milieu, is a book about survival. It is a book about a particular people that configure themselves in an imperial way by tracing their roots back to the very beginning of the creation of the world through that essential dietary component that is not only dietary, but it has other dimensions, that is corn, and how it manages to survive across time. I'm interested in the story, not only as Umberto Eco used to say, not only what the book says, but what the book means. And in that sense, even if even a character like Padre Jimenez, Francisco Jimenez, becomes an invaluable rescuer and reader of this text, and for a literary person like me, becomes a character that allows this text to exist and to perpetuate itself. So one of the backgrounds that I have in approaching this book, Jorge, has been my studies of biblical narrative, not as a theological text exclusively, but as a historical text. How did the Bible come together? What are the many books that conform the Bible? What does each of these books represent? Who wrote it? What are the difference of styles in the many books? So in often what happens within the same book in the tension of styles and messages. You have the book of Numbers, for instance, that is a genealogical book, repetitive in terms of which generation came before, who succeeded whom, who amassed power, so on and so forth. It's really conferred in its name. It's numbers and names that make for this laundry list. It's not surprising to me that the book of Numbers is far less read outside of biblical scholarship than, say, the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus. The book of Genesis is fascinating for many reasons. One of them is the fact that, for instance, Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 really tell exactly the same story, but with a slightly different bend. Where the role of humans is slightly reimagined as well. So what I wanted to do here is not to create a book that is handcuffed, so to speak, Jorge, in connection to the audience of the time, but in connection of the audience of today, kind of bringing a historical document from the past and making it present, so to speak. And I was very attuned to the two types of narratives that exist in the book. One is, as I was describing in biblical scholarship, one is the showing and one is the telling. The numbers and the names and who succeeds who, etc. And then the delicious descriptions of how heart of heaven, heart of earth, the various deities that exist, try out the wood people, the corn people, eventually the humans, and they become disappointed time and again with their creation. There is a chronological, there's a schedule to the chronology. What comes first, how is the world, how is the universe, how is nature established even before the creations, the first creation, what comes first in terms of nature, the rivers, the oceans, the mountains, the different animals, and then the various waves of the corn people, the wood people, etc. So I was interested in the showing of, I'm interested in the showing of the text and in the survival strategies of the text, and in the text as an instrument that tells the story of the time, but also tells the story of the Quiche people after that time as well. And as I mentioned my essay at the very end, and also in the introduction by Homero Arichis, there are parts of the numerical aspects that you were referring to that I have deliberately left out in order for the story to live up to this audience of today. Very mindful of my two roles, Jorge, the role of a literary historian and the role of a literary creator, that have to be balanced in the different audiences that I might have. Audiences that have never come before to the text, and audiences like you and the guests that we have today who might be acquainted with the text and know what is there, what's absent, and so on. And so I wanted to be very crystalline in my essay at the end, in what is out and what is in. But mainly the answer to the question is the audience is not the audience of the oral tradition and of the transcription in alphabetical form. The audience is an audience of the present, and my overt attempt is to insert this book through this retelling in the canon of world's narratives about origins of peoples.
Well, I think one of the things that you do wonderfully well is show and reveal the connections between this story and the Old Testament. And that actually is the historical context in which the text comes about. Because as you know, when the Dominicans arrive in 1535 with Las Casas and all these group of Dominicans who arrived, one of them is Domingo Vico. And Domingo Vico sets up this workshop with, I think, at least 6 different languages of the Confederation of Quiche. Quiche, one of them, but also Cachiquel and Sutujil and others. And Domingo Vico and his scribes and all these individuals who are part of these elites of principales or akpops, these twins, the señores del petate and viceñores del petate, these twins, these individuals immediately incorporate the alphabetical script to their traditions of guards, of history and lineages and genealogies, and incorporate as well the Old Testament immediately. So you have the so-called títulos of Totonicapan that have excerpts from Domingo Vico's translations of the Old Testament into Quiche, and just incorporate them into the text before the discussion of the history of lineages and genealogies of Totonicapan. And it seems to me that the Popol Vuh has that dimension as well, but it does it much better than Domingo Vico and all the other scribes, in that there are all sorts of echoes to the Old Testament throughout, not only Genesis and Exodus. Exodus is there throughout in the latter sections, but also in the section of the visit to the underworld, Xibalba, as a voyage, as a trip to the margins, right? But also has all sorts of echoes to the books of Chronicles, books of Kings, the prophets as well, all the relationships to idolatry and the warnings by books of prophets to idolatry and the concerns of prophecy with this behavior of the people of Judah or the kingdom of Judah and Israel to idolatry. So throughout the Popol Vuh, you have that structure, it seems to me, this dialogue with the Old Testament that is constant, that is permanent, that it really shapes the document as a dialogue with Dominicans. But it's a very creative dialogue. And I think that by you rescuing the dimensions of the Old Testament to your retelling, you're actually honoring the impulse that led to the creation of the Popol Vuh as an alphabetical document. I don't know whether you care to tell us more about it.
I can tell you, I mean, I've been doing, Jorge, 12, 15 events in different libraries and bookstores connected with the Popol Vuh, but I finally found my pair with you. I love the historical vision and the depth and complexity that you're bringing to the conversation. 2 or 3 reactions, querido Jorge. One is that not from a historical, but from a literary perspective, most of the texts that we have inherited from the colonial period are quote unquote contaminated or polluted, or call them hybrid. That is, these are texts that began, not all, but a substantial amount in oral form. They are like the Iliad and the Odyssey. They pass from generation to generation, and like water touching rocks, they polish the stories, they sharpen them, and they allow us to focus on certain aspects of the narrative more than in others. In some ways, I was very aware that in not doing a standard translation, but a retelling, I was returning somehow, Jorge, to the idea of oral tradition. Though obviously I'm writing a piece here, I'm not presenting it in an audiobook or in ways that will only exist for one audience in a theater one day. What I am doing is what in the passing of oral traditions, the narrator, the griot, does, which is add or take or emphasize or eclipse whatever aspects are, though in my case, it is obviously with a scholar's perspective. At one point, Jorge says that in one of the interviews, of the many interviews he left us with, that the transition from the oral to the written is unfortunate in that we lose the plurality, the multiplicity of storytelling to be having only a contract with one. We only have one Odyssey, and not the many Odysseys before whoever it was that was pre-Homer. I grew up reading the Popol Vuh next to 100 Years of Solitude, Rayuela, La Muerte de Artemio Cruz, Alejo Carpentier, y Borges. And because I come from a literary tradition, I was struck this time in the retelling about the misnamed magical realist aspects of the book, which obviously magical realism is a term of the 50s and 60s. Can we find magical realism in a text that dates back so many centuries when the term was not available? It's like calling Sor Juana a feminist when the term feminism was not around. But the qualities of some of the characters, for instance, being decapitated and then their head coming back to their heads, or an animal having supernatural qualities to be able to rescue one of the characters who's in a compromising situation. I find there's another essay by Borges called Kafka y sus precursores, Kafka and his precursors. It's an astonishing essay where he claims that a writer not only makes us read the present in a different way and the future as well, but the past. And so we can call certain characters in Ovid, for instance, Kafkaesque, even though Kafka came many, many centuries later, because we are encouraged to read through the lens of this particular author, the past text, the ones that preceded him. And so there are elements in the Popol Vuh that for me are a cornerstone, or the type of literature that would come later on. And in that sense, Jorge, there's something that I could not believe my eyes. The whole section of the book about Xibalba, that is the underworld, is absolutely stunning, breathtaking. And to me, the large question is, how is it that we have Dante's Inferno and Purgatory, Bunyan's vision of hell, and other versions of hell, not versions of hell in the Old Testament, but versions of hell that come after, particularly in the Middle Ages. And yet you have here something that is not quite hell, it's called the underworld. And the most interesting fights by the twins, by the second set of twins, take place in that underworld against the lords of Xibalba. The descriptions of the chambers, the currents, remind me of Xanadu, of Coleridge, remind me of certain aspects of Borges too. This is an attempt to describe the world under us. They call them satanic, or maybe simply dark deities that coexist with the upper world. And final point here, whereas in the Bible and in other narratives, you have wars, endless wars. The Bible is such a bloody text. It's such a cruel and despiadado text. And God comes across as incredibly destructive, no matter how we want to see it. The God of the Hebrew Bible is vengeful, is egotistical, is Trumpian, in a savage, carnage way. The deities that exist in the underworld are deities that are fascinated with sports, with el juego de pelotas. And that's another aspect, given that in Latin America, el juego de pelotas is a religion of now that Maradona, El Dios, has just passed away. The fact that the heroes of the story have to face adversity, the lords of Xibalba through el juego de pelotas, and have to be very dexterous. And they put their props and they look for strategies and it's as if you imagine that Beatrice, Virgil, and Dante would be playing tennis in one of the circles of hell in order to see how they pass to the next one. There's an incredible amount of humor here, maybe humor that we bring as readers of the 21st century to the past. But very few sacred texts have sports figure so prominently and connected with the underworld. I frankly think that the section of Xibalba is just as good as anything Dante left us with.
Well, that is amazing. I love that. But let me go back to the historical dimensions of the text. I don't want to to lose my identity as a historian of paperwork in the 1500s. I am really, really interested in, and I'm working on a book that it's to come out on petitions in the 1500s, and paperwork in the 1500s called the Radical Spanish Empire, and the centrality of paperwork to the making of that empire, an empire that in Spanish America was very, very socially mobile, at least from 1500 to 1570, when archives are created and mobility begins to slow down among factions, and paperwork allows factionalism to thrive and to create great upward social mobility and also downward social mobility as factions acquire paperwork to undermine their rivals through legislation, that is gobierno, or through gracia, Mercedes, or through litigation, justicia. Those three different structures of paperwork. And one of the things about the Popol Vuh as paperwork is this dimension of factionalism throughout. This is a book about rivalries within these different periods. I mean, there is the first one of creation, in which the lords, the caciques, meet justice. They are tyrants. The category of tyranny in the 1500s it's constant throughout. The caciques are tyrants, the Franciscans are tyrants, Dominicans are tyrants, the encomenderos are tyrants. Each one of them can be cast by factions as tyrants that need to be disciplined and need to be brought back from their excesses. Landa, for instance, as Franciscans, as tyrants, or whoever, Nuño de Guzman as tyrant. I mean, the trope is sweeping and cuts across all factions, including caciques and principales. And so this is a history. These are texts about caciques or lords as tyrants. The Lord of creation and his two sons are cut to shape by an uprising from tricksters. The same for Xibalba, right? You have these lords that are kind of cut to shape or cut down to size by these pairs of twins. And finally, the section that you work very beautifully, I think, on Sunrise and Promise is also about these lords that are disciplined. These tyrants that are disciplined by popular uprisings. And so I wonder whether the Popol Vuh as a book about disciplining lords and disciplining tyrants by the people from the bottom up might be a possible reading, at least my reading.
Sure. I second your viewpoint, and I want to kind of add some nuance to it. I think this is a book about power, tyranny, a version of it. It's a book about power from the very beginning. There is, even before the various waves of humans, corn people, the wood people are created, there is a power struggle between the deities, with heart of heaven and heart of earth, trying to create some sort of consensus of how those creations that they are going to make are going to succeed if they pay tribute to them. They will not be deemed successful if they are too weak or not respectful enough to their gods. So here you already have a hierarchical approach. We're deciding among ourselves, with one entity taking the lead of that decision, who is going to be el súbdito, the subaltern here, and what responsibility, loyalty, devotion, integrity will be considered appropriate. And then you have the decision, as you have also in the Bible, of failures by the lords, by the deities. These guys, the wood people didn't work. They are too weak. The corn people didn't work. They are too this or that. And then the humans come and they are also weak, but they are allowed to continue. There is a sense that the subalterns are never going to live up to the expectation, are always going to be kept in a status that will dissatisfy the creators, but life has to go on, and then the relationship between them exists. Now, once the humans are in place, there is a similar, kind of a mimetic approach as well. Who is going to be on top, and what kind of relationship are they going to have to the various folks, to the caciques, or to the other handlers of power? One of the aspects that I find mesmerizing by this book is how it plays with duality, Jorge. You don't have that in the Bible. You have in the Bible something gorgeous, and that is that language is power. God creates the world by saying, let the world be created. Without language, the world would not be created. And it pushes us to think as readers that even before the world was created, language was created. Otherwise, the world would not exist. And then when Adam and Eve come in, then Adam can name the objects of the world. A cow is a cow, a river is a river. And by naming them, takes control of those objects. And this is something that here exists. Language exists also before the creation, because they are already discussing, the deities are discussing how, by doing it with language. And then it's going to be how language is going to be used to control others. I like very much what you're saying about the paperwork. The paperwork is language implanted in a stable, static, durable form. These would be the oral tradition, which is words that can be forgotten very quickly. It replaces memory, so to speak. The dualities in the book persist in I said, mesmerizing ways, because a heart of heaven, heart of earth are the two sides, are always talking to each other. And you could also almost sometimes say there's a kind of democratic discussion among them, but it's not quite democratic. And then there's constant set of twins that become the heroes of the story. The Quiché have twins as central. And I bring again Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, where there's a crucial section of a set of twins that will divide the Buendia family. One will be in a particular way, the other one will be in a very, the José Arcadios and Aurelianos, and all the José Arcadios by name, all the José Arcadios, because they are called José Arcadios, will have a certain personality, and all the Aurelianos will have another personality because they are called Aurelianos. And that means that it's kind of yin and yang. What Aureliano is not, José Arcadio is, and vice versa. And we tend to see in contemporary culture siblinghood and gemelos, twins, as complements of each other. You know, if she does this, he does that, and vice versa. But the twins in the Popol Vuh are not either ors. The twins of the Popol Vuh are versions of the same entity that become the same entity. They are always together, or almost always together. And when they separate, you have trouble figuring out who is this and who's that. And that persists throughout the book. I am bringing this kind of as an addition to what you were saying from the literary perspective, Jorge, because it is really fascinating that in the transcription of this text, whoever did it and however that was done, there is a duality that tests the unicity of Christianity, the unicity of one God alone, and the unicity of man or humans as individuals that are in and of themselves complete. Here we have characters that need the other side to be completed all the time. And that is, I think, a very important contribution. I hope I try to emphasize it in the retelling. And I think it's something that I don't see in other tales of creation, this constant duality. Obviously, the duality of the upper world and of the underworld. And the underworld is not an afterthought here. The underworld is an afterthought in the Hebrew Bible. There's no hell. Nobody talks about hell. In the New Testament, hell becomes much more prominent. In here, hell, but it's wrong to call it hell. It's really the underworld. And the upper world son como un sandwich. Son como dos partes que van paralelas. They run parallel to each other. And you could say that the underworld is as interesting or more interesting than the upper world. And the lords of Xibalba are as interesting and dexterous and shrewd as the upper ones.
I agree, but see, one of the things that I find fascinating of Popol Vuh as a book as a biblical text of creation is that it's profoundly critical of power, and it's profoundly critical of the lords that create all these humans or all these versions of humankind, and the right of individuals to revolt against them. It's throughout the text. It is a critique of lordship that begins with creation because they fail. And so there is the right of individuals to ultimately eliminate these Lord creators, these deities that behave like caciques. And therefore these deities that are lords are eliminated first in the first part of creation, then in Xibalba as well. And also in the last section that you re-Christian as sunrise and promise, the lords are also eliminated.
And do you think, Jorge, that in that sense the book, because I see your point clearly, do you think the book is subversive in that it invites readers subtly to contemplate rebellion?
Oh yeah,
it's a power.
It's not subtle. It's very, very, very straightforward, and it's about factionalism in this world of 1540s, 1550s, 1560s, where all these texts are created. It's in all the titles. I mean, the Popol Vuh comes as part of a factional struggle between different factions of the Confederation of Quiché, the two sons the sons of two lords that are the twins of the Confederation of Quiché. We have their names. One is Juan de Rojas, and the other is Juan Cortés, right? Juan Cortés, it is the one of the descendants of the lords of Quiché that produces the título of Totonicapán, and Juan de Rojas is the son of the other lord, the other twin, the Akpop, the Señor Petate of the kingdom of Quiché, that produces the Popol Vuh. And so all the factionalism of the 1500s throughout the highlands, it's reflected in these texts. It's reflected in the very making of these narrative of creation, because throughout at least the Popol Vuh, there is this reflection on lordship as creation or as deities of deeply flawed lords that need to be cut to size. And that happens throughout, happens in creation, happens in Xibalba. Xibalba, by the way, to me, it's the land of war, of what Bartolomé de las Casas went to call Verapaz, but that's that region of the lowlands that killed the Dominicans, that kills Domingo Vico, and it's highly difficult to control, even by the Dominicans. Dominicans don't get to control that area. And so it's not a text of creation that is separated from the politics of the 1500s in that region, highlands and lowlands of Guatemala.
Fabulous. Let me add one thing here, and maybe we'll open it, Jorge, to the participants. Again, thinking about the Bible is the Bible is such a plethorous symphonic text, and it is written over a very long period of time, and there are revisions, and there are texts that don't get to be canonized, and others that do. And of course, the most significant portions of the monarchic, you could call it tyrannical, aspects of the kingdom of Israel are the ones that are connected with David, with the court of King David. And one cannot but suspect, I think, with some logic, that the author of those sections had to be in the court of David in order to present such a positive portrait of this adulterous, childish, irreverent king who faces Goliath, who desires the woman who's on the other side of his castle, and simply has her husband killed in order to have her, and so on and so forth. All the stories about David. But even those stories are painted in a very favorable way. But all this brings me to the question: a text that is produced, Jorge, by a collectivity over a period of time, a collectivity that by definition breaks loose from different factions, tensions, and it's not one authorial voice. It is not one political view. Perhaps by definition would be about fractions, about breaking apart in groups, by looking at power as always breaking away, and depending on who's telling the story from this or that side. All this to emphasize what you're saying, but also to as a statement of the authorship that is pushing in various directions in order to claim the legitimacy of power here or there, depending on the section of the narrative. But I see that our friend Eduardo has shown up like a ghost, like a welcome ghost.
I did send a note to Jorge saying, look, the conversation is going exceedingly well and fascinating. I'm aware Jorge has to leave at 6:20.
Yeah, that's right, you have a class.
I'm sure you also wanted to open this to the public. It's been a wonderful conversation. This is part of our series to encourage a dialogue between different disciplines. And here we have certainly a dialogue between someone who comes from history and someone who comes from literal. Well, Ilan has also been involved in, as you kept telling us, about history of literature studies. But nevertheless, these are two different things. I mean, you have touched upon such a variety of fascinating topics. The difference, for example, between translations and retelling, right, that you mentioned at the beginning. Incidentally, by the way, if anyone in the audience would like to ask questions, please just raise your hands. The preferred way to intervene in our seminars is just to bring you in and form part of the conversation. But if you feel more comfortable by just sending us your question in the chat, please do so. So I'm just going to sort of say a few words in order for you to think about questions. You also referred to the last part of the discussion on what is the purpose of the historical text, and what happened to the purpose of that text when it's being retold in the way you have done it, right? How can we make past text relevant to the present? I mean, this is a constant preoccupation that we all have. And then you refer constantly to the oral versus the written tradition, which I found fascinating. And the final point about what is if the text has lost its subversive purpose that Jorge highlighted. Perhaps I can sort of push you in that last point, which I found interesting. Because of I haven't read either your text or the Popol Vuh, so I'll be one of your new readers. You obviously knew about its existence and about its significance. But it seems to me from your answer, you don't think that the retelling is a subversive text, do you?
Oh, I absolutely think it's a subversive text, Eduardo. It is not subversive in the historical context that Jorge was mentioning, that is the fractionalism, the tyrannical approaches, the caciquismo of the 1500s. It's subversive in contemporary terms. This is a text that tells the story of survival, and through survival of rebellion against oblivion in favor of memory and continuity. At the very end of the text, the Father Jimenez appears, and there's a kind of celebration, but kind of contained. Here, after all, and this goes back to what you were saying, I remember once a big controversy taking place in Mexico before I came to the United States between Octavio Paz and Brodsky, Joseph Brodsky, the Russian poet, who had just written a poem about Mexico because Paz had invited him to visit the country, in which he celebrated the Spaniards for having given half of Mexico, having given us half of Mexico. And it was published, I think, in Vuelta, or I don't have the details here, but there were many people complaining that you don't celebrate the Spaniards in Mexico. They came here to destroy, they came here to erase. And Brodsky was saying, if it weren't for the Spaniards, you would not have what you have in Mexico today. There's a very the identity politics kind of a discussion. I think that the Popol Vuh is a book that it is thanks to Father Jimenez in figures like him, that we have today, and we might be very ambivalent about celebrating them, Eduardo, but in the end, that transition that happens from the oral to what Jorge was telling so eloquently, the paperwork, is a transition that occurs in the 1500s with the Spaniards, with the alphabetical language, and it's an imposition if you want. But the book is subversive in that it goes beyond all that, in saying, here we are 500 years later, memory continues, and we can see the politics of the 15th century. We can also see it as a mirror of the politics of indigenismo and in the erasing of Aboriginal cultures, and how texts are anchors to see how that erasing of cultures has taken place.
Thank you, Ilan. And we have a question from Andrew Paxman. Andrew, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you very much, Eduardo. My thanks to Ilan and Jorge for a really stimulating conversation. I have a question about the Father Jimenez and his initial translation. As you were working on the text, Ilan, how did you find the quality of Father Jimenez's work? You mentioned this term, the contamination or pollution of the text. To what extent did you find it contaminated or polluted, and how did your interpretation or your finding of Jimenez's translation differ from or coincide with what scholars have said about it before?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I was very mindful that I was approaching a translation by somebody who had come to rescue this culture with a clear agenda in mind. And I have to tell you, I don't believe in neutral translation. All translations are polluted, all translations are biased, but you can be more open about those biases or those contaminations or less. And it seemed to me that there was a lot that probably was being filtered through this mind, and that I was accessing a text that was being already accessed by someone with a very strong religious political view. And yet I did not have an easy way to overcome this by going to the oral tradition and getting the essence. So I needed to qualify it in the retelling and kind of use an internal kind of a stream of consciousness that keeps on reminding the reader that what you have in front of you has so many layers of agendas that it's never neutral and it's never innocent, including mine. I come to it, as a Mexican Jew, scholar, literary person, etc. It reminds me, Andrew, of the translators of Don Quixote have had always an agenda behind, even though we see them as neutral. And in particular in France, the second translation of Don Quixote was by a man who became obsessed with Cervantes, and who, when reaching the last chapter of part 2, could not fathom the fact that Don Quixote dies in his deathbed. So he left that chapter out. Don Quixote, for many years in France, does not die at the end of the novel, because he meant to write a third part, which he started and then died, and one of his students did. And it came out, and people thought that it had 3 parts. And so translators, traders or translators, and Father Jimenez has an evangelical approach here, evangelical in the sense of rescuing, and also in the sense of coloring what he's rescuing through his own vision. I had with me, just to conclude, the French translations that I had access to, various Spanish language translations. I had a Quiché version, I had the German, and I was comparing them, mindful that I'm not doing a scholarly text, but retelling, yet using the biases of previous translators to see where I would fit in.
Thank you, Ilan. Jorge, would you like to add something to that?
You have to unmute, Jorge.
Yeah, Jimenez is it's a very peculiar character. We know very little about him. And we know very little about what he's doing with the text and who gave him the text. And we know that he does 2 translations, right? One is the kind of literal translation, and the other is the paraphrasing translation that he includes into his history of the order. So he thinks highly of this document. This is not these are the Dominicans. He's not an inquisitor of the Popol Vuh. On the contrary, he embraces the Popol Vuh. He doesn't see the Popol Vuh as idolatrous. On the contrary, he embraces it as a text that comes from this Dominican tradition of Las Casas, Verapaz, et cetera, So that is something that we need to keep in mind when reading the Popol Vuh. It's a book of the mid-1500s, and all it means to be a book of the mid-1500s. It's a book about this struggle between conquistadores versus Dominicans in the highlands of Guatemala, in which the caciques play a significant role, settling that dispute between these 2 factions with factions of their own. And it's also a text about profound tensions within these communities of the Confederation of Quiché that are ethnic, in which people of different ethnicities take advantage of the factionalism of the conquest in order to set up their own towns and liberate themselves from the ethnic overlords that were the Quiché. So the Caciquel take advantage of this opportunity to kind of screw you, Quiché, and the same for the Sutujil, take advantage to set up their own towns, and so on and so forth. The same with the Otomís and and everybody else in Mesoamerica that are taking the opportunity of conquest to settle scores in these multi-ethnic communities. So the Otomís kind of take advantage of the opportunity of the conquest to create alliances with the conquistadors or Dominicans or whoever that is to go to Querétaro and set up their own towns and take over all the towns from Querétaro to Parral. I think we have to be very, very careful about these Manichaean understanding of the 1500s as a battle between natives versus Spaniards. There are all sorts of factions within the so-called Spaniards. Actually, Popol Vuh is a critique of mestizos, the sons of all these conquistadors that with indigenous women, who themselves became encomenderos and who themselves became very powerful lords, but by the 1570s they lost the battle against bishops and against the crown, and they became mestizos, became illegitimate, became bastards with little power. They lost, as conquistadors, they lost the battle of paperwork against more powerful factions, namely merchants that took over. So yeah, that would be my take on Jimenez.
Thank you, Jorge. And we have one question from Oliver Fletcher. Oliver?
Hi, thanks, Eduardo, and thanks, Ilan and Jorge, for a really stimulating exchange. I also have a question about translation and maybe a bit more of a procedural question. But you mentioned the Odyssey earlier, Ilan, and it made me think of Emily Wilson's recent translation, which I've been reading. And in her translator's note, she sort of poses the dilemma between quote unquote authenticity and accessibility, and sort of in elucidating that dichotomy, kind of couches her translation as being one of a modern translation and one that she hopes will be accessible. And it sounds like your work on the Popol Vuh is the same, is aspiring towards the same sort of place in terms of its readership. But I wanted to understand when you're embarking on a project like this, where you're looking to translate and bring a cultural epic to a new audience, perhaps, how do you try and choose a register or a voice or an idiom that bridges the divide there between the authenticity and accessibility? I mean, Emily Wilson, as I said in her translator's note, makes this, it addresses this debate and says it's very easy for us to kind of think of archaic, when addressing these kind of epic texts, we think about archaic language as being somehow more authentic, notwithstanding, the difference in time between a Victorian or an early 20th century translator and the origin of the text is negligible really in comparison to our own time difference. So I wanted to ask about that accessibility authenticity debate and how you chose the register that you ended up landing on.
Wonderful, Oliver. Thank you very much for that question. So you create an equation here, authenticity and accessibility, which I think cuts to the core of the translator's task when handling a historical text, because when dealing with a contemporary text that you're translating, you are longitudinally positioned where the original text is in time as well. Say a novel that came in 2017 or 2019, and you're rendering into another language. But I want to bring in a couple of two more polar aspects here, another dichotomy, and that would be between bringing the reader back to the past, the contemporary reader, back to the past, or bringing the text forward to the present. I think that the challenge of any translator that deals with a historical text is that, do you bring the reader to the moment in which it was written through language, or do you bring the text to the present through language as well? And let me give you two examples. There is a wonderful but failed translation of one of the Las Casas texts by a friend of mine, Andrew Hurley, who decided, I forget exactly the year in which the text was published, but let's say, and I don't know if I'm off the dates, Jorge, but 1570, just for the purpose. Maybe, I don't know, when did Las Casas die?
All the books of Las Casas were published 1552.
Okay, so 1552. This is a text that belongs to 1552. And he uses English without any word that has entered the language after 1552. He wants to recreate in English the language that Las Casas used in its equivalent across languages. That to me is an attempt to bring, in the archaic sense of way, the contemporary reader to feel what the contemporary reader of the original would feel when reading Las Casas in Spanish. The words are awkward, they belong to another period. Let's do the same thing in English, in the translation. The opposite would be what Edith Grossman did in the 2003 translation of Don Quixote. She uses in her translation, she's the first woman and the first American, no, not the first American, I think that she's the third American to translate the text into English. And she uses words as awesome and cool. It's incredibly popular. It hit a chord. Most people who access Don Quixote today in English do it through Edith Grossman's translation. But I mean, to me, it feels a little awkward to hear Sancho saying, "Oh, that's cool." Awesome. That is a strategy to bring a text back from the past into contemporary English language. What did I do? I tried to create a kind of middle ground. I tried to not use a contemporary jargon, but to use a language that could be in English available to readers from, say, 1950 to 2020, in grammar and syntax that is contemporary, but not using words that go back to the 1500s. I wanted this to be for a larger audience. And on occasion, when there are words in Quiché that I couldn't find the equivalent for flora or fauna, I insert the word in Quiché, and then in the next sentence, I subtly use an equivalent in English to give a sense of what it is. So it's peppered with italicized terms that come from the Quiché or from the Spanish, without making the text, I'm hoping, too alien or foreign to the contemporary reader.
Thank you, Ilan. This is a very interesting and fascinating conversation. I'm sorry, probably we'll have to bring this to an end soon because I know Jorge has a commitment soon. He has to go teaching, but we can have a last question, and that will be from Alan Knight. Alan.
Thank you. Very interesting, but it's something I know very little about. So this is a pretty ignorant two-part question, chiefly to Ilan. First of all, you hear a lot these days about cultural appropriation of ideas and texts and artifacts and so on. And I wondered, I haven't read the books, I don't know if you touched on that perhaps in the introduction or somewhere, but I wondered if you had any concerns or doubts about the work you did in that regard. The other half is a little bit more complicated. You use the term magical realism to describe this text, and you introduced the caveat, that you're using a modern term. I have no problem with that because certainly historians do that all the time. But I wondered, could you say a bit more about that? Because I'd have thought, and I'm ignorant about these things, that when Garcia Marquez uses fantastic or magical events, he knows they don't happen, but he puts them in a context so you get magical realism. Now, in your text, or indeed in the Old Testament, which you mentioned, which I know a bit better, people believed these things. I assume people believed in Moses and the burning bush. So it wasn't magical realism, it for them was real. So how far do you push this? Do you want to use magical realism as an explanatory concept, or is it just a sort of possible observation?
Thank you, Alan. sharp questions. Let me go in the order that you asked them. I mentioned in my afterwards the question, the issue of appropriation. I believe that there is no, this might sound to you a little too escapist. I believe that there's no translation that is not an appropriation, that is not a cultural appropriation. A translation, by definition, is the attempt to bring in a text in through one individual or a group of individuals, the translators, that belongs to another culture and to another individual or set of individuals. I am very attuned and sensitive to cultural appropriation today, and the cultural appropriation of those peoples who are most vulnerable and with less access of power. But I believe that there's no way of escaping the question of appropriation in translation. And the best approach is to take it frontally. This is absolutely an appropriation. The way my translation into Spanglish of Don Quixote is an appropriation. It's an attempt to give Latinos in the United States our own version of Don Quixote in this hybrid, contaminated, prostituted jargon that we speak, a mix of Spanish and English. Every translation is subjective, so there's somebody else will come and say, I can do another retelling, or Stavans did this retelling in a way that is biased. There's no non-biased translation. All translation is subjective. As to the question of magical realism, as I think everybody knows, is a very contested term in Latin America. Garcia Marquez hated it. It starts from a term, Lo Real Maravilloso, by Carpentier, after a trip that he did to Haiti. And he returns to Cuba, and it's a response to surrealism. We in Latin America know better how dreams work. It's Lo Real Maravilloso. Then the Europeans and the Americans, when translating the term Lo Real Maravilloso, come up with magical realism, which means nothing. And Latin Americans, writers certainly didn't like it, don't like it to this day. It sells copies. It ends up in the way you present covers of books, and in the color and the tactile aspect of a certain book or a certain literary tradition. However, as any category, I think that it needs to be explored and addressed. I mean, even if we don't want it, the Latin American boom was a European and American phenomenon that later on had an impact in Latin America too. There's a beautiful moment in El Coronel no tiene quien le escriba when el coronel sees a newspaper that comes from Europe and is able to know what's happening in Colombia, because in Europe they can describe the news in Colombia, which are censored in Colombia. And he suggests that maybe everybody in Europe should read Latin American newspapers and everybody in Latin America read, so that they would know their own histories or their own what are happenings directly there. After the magical realism came about with all these misconceptions and mutations, it's impossible not to think of Kafka as a magical realist, the Metamorphosis. You wake up to become a huge insect, really? Or Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, you really go into a hole and see a rabbit that is running with all those are varieties, loose ends of how we could or could not conceive magical realism. I don't believe that the Popol Vuh obviously is a magical realist book, but I think magical realism makes us, in retrospect, look at the Popol Vuh as offering a certain kind of a mix between how to access certain real events and how to access certain oniric or dreamlike events through the prism that would come later on through Borges and Garcia Marquez and all of them. People in the Popol Vuh, I have had several people who tell me that there are parts of the Popol Vuh, I think Jorge will be interested in this, they are almost like written for children. You know, there's a bird that goes and will deliver a message and come back to the underworld, or in these various chambers it's very cold, or there are snakes. It looks like Indiana Jones, or the Hunger Games. But it's very cruel and violent and bloody. And I think that there are elements in children's literature that are very magical realist. You take certain events as if they really happened. And there is an aspect here that palpitates. I'm not calling the text childish. I'm talking about the text in a way that can reach different audiences. It mainly is hoping to reach different ages. And I think in that sense, at the very least, it invites us to think of the reverberations of aesthetic modes in Latin America, both forward and backwards, using a text as a point of departure or arrival.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure Jorge would like to say something, but he has to leave unless he wants to say something before leaving. You want to have a last word where I just want to sort of wrap up this. It was a fascinating discussion. I won't say much, ignoring how precious Jorge is. We have had a set of seminar during the term that makes the term extremely rich in the discussion we have had. We started talking with a discussion on feminism for the Americas. Then we went to history of prostitution in Peru. Then we discussed Cuba in the Caribbean Cold War, exiles, revolutionaries, and tyrants. We had a session on the epic life of Toussaint Louverture. Then we talk about the Chilean Congress's networks and social and elites. We had a roundtable on the Aztecs, and we had a roundtable on the intellectual history of Latin America. So I think we've been pretty comprehensive in our coverage, and to end up with the Popol Vuh and this fascinating discussion between literature, translations, history, the text, it's been really a treat for us. And I just want to thank again Ilan and Jorge for this very nice way to end up the term. And it's very good to have you back here. I hope we will have you back again in real and not in magical realist terms. So please, if you can join me and turn on your micros and your videos to congratulate and say thank you again.
Thank you. Gracias, Jorge. Gracias.
Gracias a ti.
Jorge, thank you both for engaging.
Gracias, Eduardo.
No, thank you, really. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.